Just a note before we start. Our show talks about touchy subjects that may be difficult for some of our listeners. Take care of yourself. If you feel you need to seek help, see the links at the end of our show notes for resources.
Hey y'all, and welcome to Touchy Subjects Podcast, the podcast that aims to break the silence that tends to come with conversations around domestic and sexual violence. I'm Sean.
And I'm Amanda.
And today we are going to be discussing workplace harassment with our special guest, Kim Williams. So thank you for joining us today, Kim.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
We are so excited to have this conversation because we've talked about harassment before, but in terms of workplace harassment and what things are available to them, we haven't really had this discussion, so we're happy to have you today. And before we jump into the conversation, Kim, would you just like to introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I have worked in HR for quite a long time. I've spent a number of years, conducting workplace investigations, managing workplace investigations. And so I've been privy to a lot of kind of closed door conversations, kind of seeing things from the management point of view. And then a couple years ago, I ended up experiencing harassment myself and was in an environment where, I was the head of HR. I was dealing with a chief executive, an unsupported board, unsupportive kind of internal climate. It was just such an eye-opening experience for me to be on the other side of the table and figure out how to navigate that. But then I really started looking into this world where I'm seeing millions and millions of people who are still struggling in this space. And a lot of the advice out there I didn't find very helpful. So I wanted to try and bring words to this and start talking about my experience, the fear that can feel, and maybe some inside advice from an HR perspective to hopefully help others.
This is going to be a great conversation because this is something that so many people have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And it's kind of even gotten to the point where, like, it's just something that people kind of shrug off. Like, they don't want to ruffle the feathers or rock the boat or whatever you want to say. And so they just will take it in stride. And that's not what we need to be doing. We're not going to make those changes in the workplace if we just kind of keep letting it get brushed under the rug.
Absolutely. And I think, for decades, women in particular had to endure a great deal. And I think that there's a lot of legacy thinking, and there's no shortage of examples that people can point to, like, oh, I know someone who spoke up and it ended badly for them. And yet the world is actually changing quite rapidly. And so I would love for more people to be aware of that good news and hopefully feel a little more protected, because employees actually do have more protections than I think they may realize.
So Kim, one of the things that I'm really interested in hearing about, so you had mentioned like you'd done HR work for a while and then you started to experience harassment, and it was a little bit different on the other side of that. So what was that kind of like being on the other side from what you had been doing or known before while we're just working in HR, not having experienced that harassment?
I think the main thing that I take away, and I think is so important to talk out loud, is it's terrifying. Part of what HR is supposed to bring to this process is objectivity, to be kind of even in negotiating things between employees where things can kind of get heated or they get a little bit intense. And so you have that distance and that perspective that lets you be a little more clinical to kind of walk people down a particular path. But when it's happening to you, it's very hard to untangle that fear, because just like any employee, when your career's on the line, your career feels threatened, that threatens your entire world. People immediately go to, how will I pay my bills? Is this going to be a black mark on my resume? Will this destroy my career? What's going to happen to my kids? It affects where you live, where your children go to school. So there's so many things tied to it that it can become very intense very quickly. And managing that fear is the most challenging thing, I think, that can come with that.
Yeah, we often talk about in pretty much any careers, like if you're doing any kind of like education or just like working with people, we're taught very specific ways to interact or work with someone. And I think once you're on that other side, having experienced the thing that you're educating or talking about, it becomes a little bit different. So you can kind of at least relate a little bit more to like, oh yeah, when I was going through this, this was all the things that I was experiencing. So now I can know to address those things when I'm working with somebody else experiencing something similar.
Yeah, and I think that there's a gift buried in that, right? That like, now I can go out and help people, and I'm not just saying it from, a textbook, perspective, but I'm saying like, look, I know exactly how you feel as someone who's been there, and this is how I work through that fear. And, and I laugh about it, I joke about it. I mean, I talk about all the time. There was one incident where I knew I needed to go on the record about the abuse that was happening. I knew I didn't have support, was afraid I was going to get fired at the end of this. My hands were shaking as I wrote the email. In fact, I was so nervous that I actually drafted the email at my desk, ran to my car, hit send on my phone from the draft email, and drove out of the parking lot. And I'm like, and I want people to know that, because like, you're not alone, and it's okay. Like, I did whatever I needed to do to actually say what needed to be said and move the process forward, and ended up protecting myself and others in that process, no matter how afraid I was. And it's okay. It's not something to be ashamed of. Like, it's normal to feel that way in those moments.
And so often, like, this harassment or abuse that comes with a workplace, it's coming from somebody who has a position of power over you. It's a supervisor, it's a boss, it's a CEO, like whatever. And so it's not really just like you're going against like the person in the cubicle next to you who, has the same clout or status in the organization that you do. Like, you're going up against the boss, right? And you hear so often about how those things will get covered up, right? And you just think to yourself, like, I know this is going to happen to me, and there's nothing I'm going to be able to do about it. And I think what's really important for people to hear as well is that, like, you were working in this field and it still happened. It's not something that a person has done wrong while they're working. It's not something that they've invited in or led someone to believe that this is okay. People who choose to do this harassment or abuse are choosing to do it not because they feel like you're going to like it.
Yep. Well, and I think that was another takeaway from this whole experience that I started paying attention to, is how many folks in HR experience retaliation. Um, either for themselves, or when they're going to the boss to say, hey, someone else has a complaint about you, and the blowback and the rage that can come from that, even though it's also a protected activity. And sometimes you can see that in these toxic environments where a chief executive will pick a particular type of person, because they think that there won't be pushback, or they pick someone who's inexperienced, not trained, someone to come into HR to just do paperwork, but can't handle maybe some of these tougher sides of the job. And sometimes that's deliberate, and it can tell you a lot about the culture, because if you have someone with experience in this space and they have that good relationship with the chief executive, they address problems quickly. And I now work in that space where I have that trust in my CEO. And if an employee comes to me and they're hurting, I know I don't have to manage up in that moment, that I can go right in there and have whatever conversation needs to take place. But I'm aware a lot of other folks aren't that lucky too.
Yeah, it's going against somebody, especially when even the HR people know that it's probably not going to be handled super great, can be extremely difficult. So what kind of things would you point out to your fellow HR workers if they have a supervisor or a CEO who they believe isn't gonna really do the best in this situation?
I think they need to remember to follow their own rules, and it's funny how quickly they forget it, how quickly I forgot it. But, as soon as I brought a complaint forward, I'm engaging in protective activity. I'm letting them know that there's an issue. If they choose to, scream at me, retaliate, come back in some way and punish me, I mean, that's unlawful activity. And so, I think that there's a lot of hard wiring in HR folks to protect the secrets, protect the boss, protect the company, and they don't factor in that it's okay to protect employees, including yourself as an employee, that you have those same rights as anybody else. And when you're in those environments and when you're completely alone, to take those detailed logs, take those detailed records, take note of whatever direct evidence that you have, build that case in a way to protect yourself, so that if they continue to lash out at you, to punish you, you have something that you can take outside of the organization, whether that's an EEO complaint, a complaint through your state agency, or just directly to a labor and employment attorney, who can now act on your behalf because you've built up that strong case. And in a lot of ways, you have more power than most in HR. You do know where all the bodies are buried. You probably know everyone who's ever sued your organization and for how much. Like, it's really the last person, a clear thinking boss probably wants to engage in that space, but it's not always like a clear thinking kind of activity.
So, and I don't know how much experience you would have with this, but I just want to ask because I think it's something that would be valuable to our listeners. What about people who work for a company that doesn't have an HR department? You've got like tons of people working in like restaurants and like little independently owned places. What kind of protections do they have?
A lot of them are still the same, and so you have, the federal protections over, protected characteristics, and then state by state or jurisdiction, even you can see additional protections that are put on place with that. And so just like with anyone else, I always recommend starting that log. Very, very simple. Just have a working document, save it on your phone, send text to yourself, time stamping events when things happen. That is just a very kind of cold, clinical time, date. Here's who was present. Here's what was said or what action took place. And then just keep doing that, unless it's something serious, of course, and if it's very serious, you want to call the police or you want to take stronger action. I think it does two things. One, it helps build your case. So if you do have to get an attorney involved or some kind of outside help involved, the more direct evidence you have, the better. But also can help you when you're in those fearful moments, kind of get clarity around your thoughts and present your case in a better way. Even with small companies, if they do have a handbook of any kind, I also recommend copying and pasting anything that they have on harassment in the workplace, what their procedures are, because that's not just for you, it's for them. And if they violate their own procedures, in some jurisdictions, that can be a breach of contract and you can sue on that basis. So that's something to also take note of. And then putting in writing, emailing that supervisor, emailing that boss, emailing anyone, so that you have some sort of discoverable evidence saying that you put them on notice, because if they ignore you now, that's on them. And then, of course, always reaching out to a state agency. You can reach out to EEO. So many labor and employment attorneys will talk to you for free, and just a lot of them are in it because they really care about this stuff. They're civil rights oriented. Some of them have experienced it themselves, and just say, hey, I have this, what do you recommend? And they can help you shape a claim so that if your company continues to ignore you, then they are now in a good position to act on your behalf.
Now, Kim, would a lot of those recommendations also be for people who are, let's say, working for a company who has HR, but the HR department views themselves as being there to protect the company or the CEO versus protecting the employees?
Yeah, I think you would do the exact same things, but I would call out HR. I would say, as I have come to you, because in some places, HR may be personally liable for ignoring you. And so you're putting them on the hook. And in some ways, you may be empowering them, because the company is going to judge what they do next based on how you show up. And so, someone who whispers a complaint, they'll be like, they might brush off. But someone who puts something clearly in writing, who presents well, who might look good in front of a jury or an outside investigator, that might make the hairs on their neck stand up. And so even if HR has that really difficult boss, she's now not going to that person, or he's not now going to that person saying, hey, we have a complaint. But we're like, no, we have something that could really put us on the hook here.
So kind of like we've been alluding to a bit is like typically HR, or at least sometimes HR, is being viewed as being there to protect that company or to protect the CEO or the managers that are in place. What steps do you think we could start taking to where we start getting rid of that stigma of HR being there to protect the company and instead viewing HR as someone who is there to protect employees or do what's going to be best for their company while also still keeping in mind or trying to make sure that employee is going to be in a good place.
I think, HR definitely needs to change. That's part of the reason why I want to get out there and start talking about this, because as I was looking, I didn't see anyone else talking about these things very openly. I've always actually had the belief that by taking care of the employee, you are taking care of the company. And the stakes are getting higher and higher. And so a lot of HR professionals, they're trained by outside attorneys. They work inside a system that wasn't, that was written by outside attorneys that was purely to protect the company from liability. And so they do have opportunities to reflect on themselves, where they fit in this system, what the damage is to the company if they ignore it. I think simple things like just following jury trials, they have exploded. I mean, you're seeing, one discrimination case in Texas not that long ago, 366 million that FedEx had to pay to one individual for discrimination. And so arming yourself with that information, to present to your company, like, you can't afford to ignore this. And public companies now, I mean, if a CEO is caught up in, say, like a Me Too scandal or some of those things, I mean, you can see stock prices drop 5% the next day. And now what's happening is shareholders are beginning to sue those boards if they had knowledge of it and didn't do anything. And so we're seeing a whole bunch of more creativity around, how companies are being held accountable. Plus, you've had more than 70 laws come into effect since the start of Me Too that are also designed to hold companies accountable and to empower employees. So the trend is moving hard in that space. We're seeing really good stuff happening on the legal front. We're seeing amazing activity from Gen Z. I had posted on LinkedIn, it was this woman in Arizona, worked on a construction site. The manager came in there, swore obscenities at her, went to slap her, ended up like hitting her arm. She's filming him the whole time. And he had obviously done this so many times, he didn't even care that she was filming. So she posted this on TikTok, and 8 million views later, his career's destroyed. That company is going to probably never get contracts again or really struggle to overcome this. And so, I talk about that all the time. You ignore these things, you are one viral TikTok away from destroying your reputation, let alone the lawsuits that now can follow along with that. So hopefully the more people know that and the more HR knows that can begin to shift things internally in a better way.
I love this because, like, we've gotten into a place in society now where we're not protecting people anymore. We're not saying, oh, well, they make a lot of money, or they, run this great big company, so they're immune to all of these things. And we're calling them out on it, and we're putting them on blast and like showing the world, like, hey, these are the things that happen. And like you said, that's something that I love the most about Gen Z is, like, they're not willing to put up with it. And they're just like, this is how it's going to be. And I love it.
I do too. I mean, especially, I'm a woman in my 50s who grew up from the, you're a servant to everyone, you don't question anything. And I'm like, why haven't we done this sooner? And so, yeah, I agree. Kudos to them for changing things.
Oh yeah. I love working with my students because it's so fun seeing them, like, the threshold that they have for like taking shit from anyone is extremely low, and I love it.
Yep. We can learn a lot from them. That's for sure.
One of the things that you did also kind of point out in there is that when HR starts trying to protect their employees versus just protecting the company or the CEO, they're putting the company in a position where it's actually going to be better. Because if you have that one bad actor up at the top, well, that's going to affect every person underneath that. So the workplace culture isn't going to be one where you're going to retain your employees very long. And if you're constantly having to train new people, or people are constantly leaving and saying it was because of this, or this, like, you're going to have a hard time getting the good employees you want to join you or to stay there. So it's so mind-boggling to me how we have to protect the company at all costs, but when you're protecting the company or the people up at the top, you're directly impacting the company and making it worse.
You're absolutely right. And I think one thing that is helping right now is we have better performance analytics and data than we used to have. So much of HR was just on assumptions. Because you're right, your point that you just made is feels like common sense, that people don't hang out where they're treated bad, and there's lost opportunity cost, and you have gaps, and you can't serve, whoever it is you're trying to serve when you're constantly turning over on folks. But what's amazing now is they're starting to put a dollar amount on that high cost of the brilliant jerk. And because a lot of times it's a decision of, oh, well, we have this salesperson and they bring in $1 million a year, but they're a nightmare for the 10 people who work with them. So now if you look at those 10 salaries of the people who are subjected to constant abuse, they're not giving you 100%. Maybe they're giving you 60. And so take 40% of those 10 salaries and flush it down the toilet. You've just lost that money. Is he worth that now? And so I think the deeper we get into that, it's going to make it harder to ignore that as well.
Right. And we know that, like, on a human level, no, this person isn't worth it, right? But for a company who's like got to look at that, bottom dollar amount, when we can start putting value signs on those things, it can make people stop and take a look.
Yeah, absolutely. And it takes away that argument of fiscal responsibility, which, I'm definitely the kind of person who doesn't, from a human perspective, I know, that's not all what business can be about, but I'm like, come on, there's also a moral argument that I think that there's a values argument in terms of, how you treat people is also how you treat customers and how we function in the world. I think that idea is changing too.
Yeah, it's and it's something you can take to use with almost anything, not just trying to work in HR. When I'm constantly trying to work with businesses to have me come in and do a sexual harassment training, or to do my bar training program to get them to help recognize the signs of sexual harassment or assault in their bars so it doesn't happen. Yeah, I can say, like, you should do this because it's a good thing to do. But if I can bring with me saying, like, hey, we've had bars say that they go through this training program, they've seen their female clientele increase, which, if you know anything about a bar, the more women you have showing up to the bar, the more men you're going to have showing up, and the more people who are then going to be buying drinks. So you're going to start making more money.
Right.
But on the flip side of that, if you don't go through this training and you end up having an issue, well, word spreads pretty quick. And if somebody's like, oh, I was harassed at this bar, or I was assaulted at this bar, you're going to have less women start showing up. And if you have less women showing up, you're going to have less men showing up. So if I can give them this, like, this is the financial benefit of doing this training, or this is the financial benefit of working with us, more people are going to do that from a business perspective, because that's usually what they care about the most. While we can say you should definitely care about, like, the moral reasonings for doing it, if it's not affecting their bottom dollar, they're not going to want to.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I also think too, you can even add to that just how viral these stories go. Like, of all the stuff that goes online, those are the kinds of things that really take off and can take years to overcome.
So speaking of then the harassment that people are experiencing, what are some of the things, Kim, that you have recognized or see the most in terms of the types of harassment that people are experiencing, or what trends are you kind of seeing?
I think a lot of times what you'll see is, toxic environments are almost like a gateway to other issues, and so it kind of creates the fertile ground where you see more abuse of power issues, where you get into some of your worst discrimination cases, some of your worst harassment issues that can come up from that. And so, really thinking about those things ahead of time can be helpful. I also, of course, I'm a huge fan of a lot of the DEI work that's been done over the years, but my whole thing, or my experience or my kind of journey has really led me to focus most heavy on accountability, particularly like in the HR space where you're coming in and doing, like a sexual harassment training. And even if it's mandated, like in a state like California, if the boss says no, what happens now when you're, in that power dynamic? And what does that mean for the community? If you make every other employee go through something and then the boss A doesn't do the training or doesn't respect the training and still continues to act a particular way, it sends a horrible message to rank and file about what's okay and what's not okay. Um, And so one of the most effective things I think I ever heard about in terms of Me Too and sexual harassment was an attorney who gave up a talk to a bunch of chief executives and said, I'm the guy that's going to destroy your career and take your house. And they heard him. So, and I was like, that's a really good point. And it's not that we shouldn't do those other things, but I think, you know, you've got an insane number of very powerful folks who have fallen through, Me Too processes. And on the other side of those folks, I mean, every one of those guys, Harvey Weinstein had an HR shop. What were they doing in there? Were they doing trainings? Were they having these conversations? And on the other side of every one of these guys was an incredibly brave woman, who was going up against these environments, taking huge risks, career destroying risk, inviting in all different kinds of abuse and blowback and harassment just by speaking out. So yeah, to me, it's all about accountability.
The other interesting piece in there was that having the leaders go through with their trainings and then commit to like what they're getting from the training, because I don't know why it's such a hard concept for people to understand, but if your leaders are not following through with what you're being taught to do, they're not going to do it. Like even on a sports team, like your team captains are the ones that are setting your tone. And if your team captains are lackadaisical, they're not super competitive, or they're not pushing their players to be better, you're going to have a bad team.
I think some of it is fear. I've sat in closed door spaces with top executives after they'd said something racist or they'd said something sexist, and I've had to go and talk to them and say, this really isn't okay. And it was always a little bit surprising to me how terrified they could be in those situations. I think it gets into a lot of deep stuff. Some of the DEI can get into, well, are you questioning whether I should be here? All of this stuff is saying that it's not a level playing field, and I benefited. Are you attacking my confidence, or or is this something that you're saying that like I'm a bad person now? And it can be hard stuff for people to kind of face, and so I think there can be some of that too, where there can be just like legitimate blind spots. We're like, I don't need this. I'm a really good, kind, caring person, and so they're not wanting to engage in that because they think that they've already done the work and that they think that they're already there. And then some other folks may be aware somewhere in their head that there's an issue, but they're afraid of what that can mean if they engage in that conversation.
Well, and I think, and this is my personal opinion, but I feel like so many people who have grown up with these roles as their aspiration have seen everyone else and the way that they acted in them. So whether that was, their mentors or their parent or grandparent or whatever, and they saw the way that they were able to behave. And so now going into those roles, they're thinking the same thing. They're like, this is what I've been working for. This is what I'm owed. And when you all of a sudden tell them that, like, no, you don't get to act like that anymore, then they're taking that personally. They're like, but this is what I'm owed. And you're like, well, actually, no. And neither were your parent, and neither were your grandparent, neither was your mentor or any of those people. But now we're actually going to stand up and say something about it.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. It's foreign, and so many of us can end up in these kind of echo chamber environments, and particularly with some of the folks that I've dealt with, that are in their 60s or 70s. And so, I mean, and they've lived in a small insular community that's reinforced a particular message for that many decades. It can be terrifying for them to question something outside of that.
Yeah, it's one of the harder things that even Amanda and I struggle with working with people in the community is if you want to improve your community, like you have to have those hard conversations and say, hey, some of the stuff that a lot of us have been doing for a really long time are not great. And for, like you said, those people who have just, that's so ingrained because that's the messaging they've been getting for decades. Like, how do you combat against that when that is the only thing that they know? And that can be a really difficult thing to try to figure out how to do.
Yeah, it is. And I know in some instances I've been able to help a small bit by going first, by taking the pressure off to say, here are the dumb things I've done. I'm a woman in my 50s with a teenager. She tells me 100 times a day the dumb things I do. And so, but I'm the kind of person like I'm not afraid of feedback. I want that feedback. I want to be doing better. I want to make the world better for her. And so sometimes by coming in at those angles and saying, here's the mistakes that I've made, and saying, and I didn't die, and it doesn't have to be the end of the world to face that, and say, I come from this because I want to be a good, kind person. Don't you? Or, whatever words may resonate with them or characteristics may resonate with them. And sometimes there can be a path there to help folks.
And of course, you know, we all want these people in these top positions, or the people who would potentially be abusers, to realize the error of their ways and to act in a better way, right? Um, that's the goal. But there's a lot of steps between now and then. So I think something that's really important for us to do also now is to teach people that they don't have to accept it. If we can get in with people who are just starting to enter the workforce, whether that's their first jobs out of high school or they're just now graduating from college and looking to get into these companies, letting them know that, like, hey, if XYZ thing happens to you, it is not acceptable. You don't have to put up with it. And here is how you take the steps to.
Well, it's funny though, because as you were saying that, that's what I kept thinking about. For years, it was all about silence. To me, like when you look at abuse in its broadest terms, there's usually a lack of vocabulary. We don't have the words for it. And that's how a lot of that stuff perpetuates. It's just, we just know. We can feel that some people deserve this and some people don't deserve it, but we don't know why and we don't talk about it. And, I think anytime somebody goes through that messy conversation, struggles for that word, sticks their neck out, is vulnerable and tries, it's like the bravest thing in the world. And it is changing the entire world, kind of one conversation at a time.
So, seeing as we're not fully at the point yet where it's not a scary thing to go to HR or talk to them and say, hey, I'm experiencing this. What, I know, and we kind of hit on it a little bit earlier too, but what legal options are available for anyone who is experiencing harassment in the workplace, but they might be experiencing some of that fear? Like, what could be some things available to them?
Yeah. And so, I think like we talked about before, kind of reaching out to the experts in the process, taking things outside the company walls. There can be a lot of power in that, whether that's through like EEO, state agency, an attorney, whatnot. But also too, like, fear at some levels, and if it's intense enough, can really take a pretty heavy toll on folks. And so a lot of times it's not a bad idea to reach out to your doctor and say, I'm going through this horrible situation at work. I'm really stressed with this. I know in some jurisdictions, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I recall speaking to one recently from New York who talked about, like, if medical records are now involved, the damages go up. And that doesn't always mean that like you have to go straight to trial, but that changes the leverage, and it changes the conversation and the dynamic that may be going on in terms of internal conversations. And so, if you're in just such a bad place where you are so paralyzed with fear and you're trying to work through that, definitely get help. Use your insurance, use whatever is available to you, and keep those records. Doctors sometimes too may say purely because of a toxic work environment that you need to go on leave, and they can give you, if you've been there long enough and you qualify for FMLA, you can take up to 12 weeks. It's not it's a job protection. You don't necessarily get money from that, but it could be something to look at in terms of giving yourself that space to kind of clear your head, to heal a little bit, to engage, and your job is protected during that time. Sometimes folks also use it as a transition point. They'll go out on FMLA. It lets them say on paper they're still with a current employer. They can't be retaliated against for medical leave. You don't have to disclose why you're taking medical leave and look for another job. But I've even seen in cases too where it can become a workers' comp claim. If the abuse is so bad that it's now a work-related injury, you've been harmed on the work site, that you can actually get funds through that and get compensation through that. And so that's definitely something you'd want to really talk to an attorney about, because depending on what state you're in and what jurisdiction in, you'd want to kind of tap into a local expert there.
That workers' comp one seems really important to remember, because
Hmm.
I feel like it ends up being where like, oh yeah, I hurt my back at work, or like
Yeah.
I broke my arm or something. Like, oh yeah, workman's comp because you got hurt at work.
Yeah.
But just like we ignore mental health as like also just taking care of your regular health, we're ignoring it in this situation as well.
Yeah.
If your mental health is being degraded because of your workplace, that's a workplace injury because that's going to impact not only your work but everything outside of it too.
You're absolutely right. And pre-pandemic, it was very, very hard to prove a stress claim. But I think that the world has changed quite a bit in those last couple of years. And I can tell you my own harassment claim, particularly because they did an investigation. At the conclusion of that investigation, they put in writing that they sustained allegations of abuse. So I filed a workers' comp claim and got a check from that. And it wasn't like a huge amount. I didn't go through like this big, heavy process. What I wanted to do was establish more of a record that the company was refusing to engage this individual. And so, the adjuster, the claims adjuster who spoke to me said they had never seen a letter like that before, and that they were saving that, and that any time a complaint came up involving this individual on a workers' comp claim on a go forward, they were automatically going to approve it. And so, it's an opportunity to, put the company on notice and to help the next individual. Because if you're being abused, it's rarely just one person, somebody else is probably suffering in your organization.
And this helps set a precedent within the company as well. Because if they look at it and they say, hey, you know what? We're having to pay workers' comp claims because this employee is, abusing or harassing our other employees, they're going to take notice of that. And especially if it happens more than once, then, I mean, I'm not saying like we're all out there trying to get everybody fired, but if somebody is a habitual abuser or harasser in a workplace and it's affecting the whole company, then, it may be time to just cut those strings and say, bye bye, baby.
Exactly. And that's my framing as well. Like, I never recommend going after to try and get a big check, even if you see other folks do, because you don't know what jury you may have and you just don't know the outcome. And it can be a really stressful experience. I use it as a leverage point to say, firing this person may cost you nothing. Having a hard conversation is free. I mean, there's so many better ways to deal with it, and prevention is so much better than the trauma that can be inflicted on so many folks by not having these kinds of conversations. So, yeah, coming at it with that framing, you're right. It does take notice, it does set precedent, and it makes it harder for a company to ignore.
So, Kim, realizing we're getting towards the end here, you've mentioned fear quite a bit in this because it's a scary thing to have to report someone to HR. Uh, so, what would be some tips or recommendations you might have for somebody to kind of help manage that fear a little bit?
Um, Definitely self-care. I know it's cliche, but do whatever you need to do to make yourself feel better. Like I couldn't have survived my experience without yoga, not even hard yoga, but like restorative yoga where you laid on pillows. By the time I got to Friday night, I drank half a bottle of wine and ate a giant bag of Reese's Pieces. It made me feel better. I painted. I did whatever it was that was unique for me to just like burn things off, and to get things off. Look at your support system, like, Sean, I know before the call we were talking about somebody I was trying to help this week whose husband didn't support her. And that's heartbreaking to hear. And that does happen quite a bit. But make sure you're connecting with those folks that aren't telling you to shut up and take it. Look for those individuals who will walk with you on that and encourage you to be brave and hold your hand and say you've got this, and try and get those people with you on that. Your body's going to be full of cortisol, and I think don't ignore that. If you're a runner and you need to burn that off, go do that. But make sure you're really taking care of yourself because you are legitimately going through a traumatic experience, a very hard experience. And I don't think we gain anything by brushing that off or saying that it's less than it is. And it may not be helpful for folks who are going through this moment now, but there actually will come a day where you're going to be glad that you went through this. And I know that that's going to sound completely insane, but some of these fears that I went through were like my worst fears about what could happen with my career, what could happen with my family. And it was so much worse in my mind than what actually happened. And so by walking through that door, you become so much stronger. and in ways that will change you for the rest of your life, that you will never be as vulnerable with this because you work through this process. And for me, I would use different mantras to kind of help things in my head. And one of them was like an old quote about the treasure that you seek is in the cave you fear to enter. I don't know if you've ever heard that expression. And so there are gifts in walking through this process that will protect you in ways that you may not realize. And I also like to tell folks that it's not just you that's scared. Your boss is scared. They wouldn't lash back out if they weren't scared. HR is scared. Everyone is scared except for maybe the attorneys who are just getting paid to manage this whole thing. So you're not alone in any of that.
Yeah. Kind of really quick too on that. It's interesting because like we talk about when we talk about abuse, abusers are going to use a lot of the same tactics because they work. So there's no new abuse tactic that we're ever going to like discover randomly one day. But it's that use of fear to control other people from doing it. The reason that your manager is trying to make your life hell at this point now is they are very afraid that if you go forward and report this, that something bad is going to happen to them. So if they can make you fearful enough of them or what could possibly happen to you in terms of like your career or personal life or making it so you can't afford your house payments anymore, they're doing that because they know if they can scare you enough, you're not going to go through with all these reports.
1,000%. Yes.
And the biggest fear, like you said, of this is going to be the fear of the unknown, because you've probably never gone through this before. You've never pushed to that limit. And in our heads, we automatically sometimes always think of all of the things that could go wrong with this. I'm going to lose my job, and I'm going to lose my house, and I'm going to lose this and that and everything else. But try and reframe that thinking to what could happen when things go right.
Yes. Yes. That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us today, Kim. Really enjoyed this conversation. But before we sign out here, is there anything else you want our audience to know?
Yeah. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I like to highlight stories about, jury trials and things that hopefully can be leveraged in people's conversation, hopefully just maybe help them internally feel a little safer to engage in these conversations. I like to talk about, advice in navigating this space, some of my own personal experiences, highlighting the experiences of others. I also have links on there at the very top of my profile. So, if anybody is looking for an attorney, I do work with some free networks that can potentially help folks there. So feel free to reach out. This is something I care deeply about. I think once you go through this, you almost become like an evangelical, and you want to make sure that no one else goes through it. So always happy to help someone who just wants to DM me or reach out. I'm here.
Awesome. And I'll make sure I have a link to your LinkedIn in the show notes of the episode if anyone does want to go and find her. And again, thank you for joining us today, Kim. And thank you all for listening today. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at TouchySubspot to keep up to date when we have new episodes and other content going out. Please email us any questions, comments, or concerns to touchysubjectspodcast@gmail.com. And please rate and follow us on your favorite podcast listening app. It really does help the show out.
And in the meantime, don't be afraid to challenge, ask, and discuss when it comes to touchy subjects.